The re-emergence of Australian cinema in the 70s continued and flourished even further in the 80s, sticking with a number of trends that were commercially successful, but also introducing new ones as a result of a newer model for film production that was introduced. The prestigious art house dramas and period pieces continued on through government funding, and they were even becoming more present and successful at renowned festivals. But these kinds of films weren't as common as the cheaper Ozploitation films, which included all sorts of trashy action and horror films. The reason for this influx in more lowbrow and commercially viable content was due to a tax incentive introduced in October 1980 called 10BA, where its investors could claim 150% tax concessions at risk and a further 50% concession on any profit. I'm not an expert on finances or taxes, but apparently this was an easy way to make a shit ton of money. And so, government financing became less prominent as it was viewed as not being inclusive to these genre films. It was the public who were now bankrolling the films, and even if they didn't make a profit at the box office, they didn't even need to for investors to get their concession. Over the years, the amount of films being made and the overall budget increased. 270 films were made in this decade, compared to 110 during the 70s, with nearly $1 billion spent on them in total. The films thrived and were becoming more commercially successful than films of the 70s, especially as the Australian identity was becoming a hot commodity of itself, thanks to some internationally popular tourist ads featuring Paul Hogan, who soon afterwards appeared in Crocodile Dundee. The cultural differences of the stereotypical larrikin in the Big Apple made it a huge, unprecedented success, becoming for a long time the highest grossing Australian film. It seemed overseas audiences were starting to enjoy the Australian culture just as much as Australians were, with the cultural cringe evaporating and a more positive self-portrayal emerging in this decade than before. Many kinds of trends that began in the 70s flourished in the 80s, mostly thanks to 10BA, such as the coming-of-age comedies that tapped into the youth market, as well as, conversely, tough-as-nails films that this country was adept at producing, namely a couple of prison films which showed the more authentic and brutal portrayal of prison life this side of Oz. But some of the trends from the 70s became lost. The ochre comedies were certainly dying out, the comedy genre instead replacing them with a slightly more matted but still slapstick affair, and a few of the well-regarded Australian filmmakers of the 70s migrated to Hollywood in the 80s, actors and directors alike, leaving Australian cinema of this time for a new generation of newbies. There was also a reverse issue with American actors being placed in Australian films, lowering the amount of acting jobs from its already low number, which caused concern in the Actors Equity Association. The 10BA scheme lost its popularity throughout the decade as the government became anxious about lost tax revenue through it, and its concession was lowered twice by Treasurer Paul Keating, first in 1983 and again in 1985. By 1989, 10BA had become a flat 100% write-off. In its resurgence in the 70s, Australian cinema was admirable in how much it was able to suddenly emulate the quality of the films being released in the USA and Britain. But just like in these countries, this quality declined in the 80s, though still offered an exciting time for cinema and how it could reflect our cultures of these specific eras.